What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you guys know that I'll probably go back to alternating between shorter videos and longer videos. An hour and 30 minutes for every single video is not super sustainable in the long run, so I'll probably do those every other day or every 2 days. I can't exactly promise a specific length at a specific time or anything. Of course, there will continue to be daily videos, so if you enjoyed this one, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those helps the video and the channel to do well, and ensures I can keep making these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' thoughts on the stories therein. Last but not least, if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do by just watching the videos, please be sure to hit that join button somewhere around the subscribe button. It's only $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons to use when you comment and beside your name when you comment. The videos will never be locked behind a paywall, it's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel even more. Without further ado though, guys, I will let you get right into the video, and I hope you enjoy today's true scary stories. The scariest case I ever took on was when a woman in her 40s gave me a ring and told me she reckoned her husband bought it for a bit on the side. Those kinds of jobs are my bread and butter, so off I popped following this bloke around, trying to catch him out with his bit of crumpet while the wife's at home bathing the kids or something. About a week goes by, and no matter how much I follow this guy around, he never seemed to do anything too dodgy or go anywhere remotely naughty. Actually, I was getting a bit frustrated when one afternoon after he finished work, he started driving out to the middle of bloody nowhere. All I could think was, I've got him now, don't I? His one bit of unusual behavior, traveling out of town. This has got to be it. Only he didn't go out to some bloody travel lodge or something. He went right out to the beach, into this little boathouse hidden amongst some sand dunes. I'm thinking to myself, what the heck kind of place is this? What kind of bloke meets his bit of skirt in a place like this either? Either way, I grab my camera and start sneaking down toward the shack to get a picture of the two in action. I'm right up on the door, edging it open, getting ready to snap a shot of this fellow's pale, hairy bottom going up and down like the clappers, when I feel something cold and metallic push against the back of my head. "You the police?" someone asked. If I'd have said yes, there's no doubt in my mind that my brains would be splattered all over the inside of that boathouse, because what felt like a piece of pipe was actually a single-barrel 12-gauge, a proper old farmer's blunderbuss. I said, "No, I'm not. I'm a private eye investigating things, just shagging about." There was silence for a moment. Then he poked me in the back of the head with the barrel so hard it hurt. "Get in the shack now." I go in and see there's all these black plastic packages in the hull of a small rowing boat. Gargs had to be the only reason he'd be willing to kill a copper. That big boy money, so to speak. The fella held me at gunpoint, made me strip down, went through all of my stuff, making sure I was who I said I was. He was only satisfied when he saw my business card. He asked me again why I was following him, and I told him honestly, "The missus reckons you're shagging about." Good God, my voice was quaking like you wouldn't believe. He took the gun off me and laughed to himself. "Here's what's gonna happen, okay? You're gonna take this $5,000 off me, go back to my missus and tell her I'm not having an affair. You tell her I take long walks on the beach. Tell her I'm going bird watching or something. You don't tell her the truth. Got it?" He kept one of my business cards to let me know he was deadly serious. "You do any messing about, and there's people I work with that will come find you." I knew he was being deadly serious. Needless to say, getting paid twice for one job was great stuff. But thinking I was about to get my head blown off by a secret drug dealer in a hidden beachside boating hut, I can't say I'd recommend it, to be honest. I had this really weird thing happen a few decades ago during the summer. Around that time, we lived in this beautiful house out in the country. My older brother and my stepmom's younger brother, who was about my age, would take turns hanging out at each other's houses. I personally didn't like hanging at her brother's house much because it was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I wasn't really a big fan of that town. On the weekends, though, he would come over to our place, and we almost always went on a hike in the surrounding area. There was a ton of countryside we loved to explore. My brother and Pete, my stepmother's brother, were always out doing things together. And I mean really, really stupid things. Here are just a couple of examples. Once my brother wondered what it would feel like to piss on an electric fence, so he went and did it. Also, once at the top of the hill, there was a circular roll of hay. They decided to unravel it and roll it down the hill. Well, after they did that, every single cow that was grazing went running for that hay. We once came across a huge bulldozer sitting at the top of a hill too. They wanted to climb in the cab and mess with the gears, but fortunately I was able to talk them out of that one. One of the dumbest things I can recall them doing was taking a rock and throwing it at a bull's balls. Fortunately, when I found out they were trying to do something so moronic, I made my way up a tree before it happened. Even more fortunately for them, they were able to get up as well before being bored to death. So every time we went out on our little hikes together, I kept expecting these two guys to do something exceptionally stupid. Honestly though, the most memorable hike we ever did didn't involve those two doing something stupid at all though. We'd had some frozen pizzas and watched some videos the night before, so we were really looking for something different to do on this day. We went out together. Now mind you, we lived really way out in the country. I mean, it took nearly an hour and a half to drive to the nearest town from where we were. The houses were obviously very far apart from each other as well. In fact, on the hill that we lived on, we were the first house up there. If you went further down the roads, it was nearly a 30-minute drive to the next house. We didn't know anybody in the area because of this. Plus, every single time we went out for an adventure, we never came across other people. We never came across any other hikers, we never stumbled across other houses. There were plenty of electric and barbed wire fences and animals, but no people to speak of whatsoever. On this particular day, we ended up spending a lot of time outside. I'd brought along a thermos of the worst flavored Kool-Aid, lemon lime. Whenever I tell this story, I can still taste that crap in my mind. We had been out for a really long time, walking across a few streams, climbing up and down hills. What was strange about this day, though, was that we were out a lot longer than we usually would be. Even when we ran out of stuff to drink, we just started drinking water from streams and creeks. As I was bending down to get a sip of water from a creek next to me, Pete came running up behind my brother and I. "Hey guys, you gotta see this, you won't believe this." He was speaking in very whispered, excited tones. "Just don't make too much noise, okay? This is the freakiest thing I've ever seen." My brother and I followed close behind. He kept insisting we try not to make too much noise as we were walking. It was difficult because the ground was littered with dried and decaying leaves. He led us and crouched over to an area overlooking a creek. And that's when I saw the weirdest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Of course, keep in mind I was only 13 at that time. There was a huge man walking by the creek. I mean, he must have been the biggest man I'd ever seen. He was completely naked and covered in matted hair, which practically made up for not having clothes on. Even scarier, he was dragging a corpse behind him slowly. We couldn't tell if it was human or anything. It was skinned and he was dragging it along, which seemed quite weird to us. We all watched as he slowly walked back up the creek. I was trying not to make any noise because I was scared of this terrifying naked behemoth. I didn't want him to turn around and find us. If he did, I had no idea how he would react. That's why I was so tense. Remember how I told you earlier that Pete and my brother liked to do really stupid things when we went out? I just had every feeling they were going to do something to provoke this man's attention. I just remained as still as possible, ready to run faster than both of them if they did something dumb. Surprisingly enough to me, they were too scared to do so. The man kept dragging his corpse and eventually stumbled out of view. The whole thing was so bizarre, but what really got to me was this. Pete and my brother were willing to smack a bull in the balls with a rock, but they weren't willing to do anything to get this man's attention. That means they were more scared of what we saw that day than they were of a raging animal. Just let that sink in. This happened when I was in my teens. I can't remember exactly when, but I think I was around 17 or so at this point. It was the school holidays, and I was at home with my friend, who we'll call Talia, and my domestic worker, who we'll call Lasego. It was around 11 a.m. or so, and we were just hanging out in my room together. Lasego had been washing dishes when she glanced out of the window. In another window, she saw the reflections of two men in our backyard. She ran upstairs to tell me what she had seen, and I immediately hit the panic button. The alarm started sounding loudly throughout the house. I remember calling my dad to tell him what was happening, but he was working quite far away and would take some time to get there. I believe he called the police at that point. I wanted to run downstairs and lock the security gate at the bottom, but at that point, over the loud wailing of the alarm system, I could distinctly hear the crack of wood splintering as they broke in the back door of the house. I was worried they would be faster than me and decided not to go downstairs to lock the gate. Instead, we raced across the upstairs landing to lock ourselves in my parents' bedroom. We reached the bedroom door and there was no key. We ran back across the landing again. Just as we were passing the top of the stairs, we saw those two men bounding up them just a meter away. They were both extremely large, clutching in their hands a screwdriver and a rope. Not a good sign. Lasego tried to grab our cell phones from the guest room as we passed. One of the men slapped her across the face, grabbed the phones, and pushed her into the room. Talia and I kept running, with the two men just a couple of meters behind us. We reached the end of the landing, dashed into my mom's office, and slammed the door hard behind me. My heart sank as I heard the clink of the key hitting the opposite wall. It had been on the other side of the door. At this point, Talia was hysterical, crying in the corner with both hands on her head as I held the door shut. What are we gonna do? I felt strangely calm though. I just remember thinking I could not let anything happen to either of my friends. There was a knock on the door behind me. Hello? I was in utter disbelief as these two intruders calmly knocked on the office door as if what was happening was the most normal thing in the entire world. We didn't respond. They knocked again. Hello? Once again, we didn't respond. The two men started turning the doorknob and pushing the door open against my back. I tried to stop the knob from turning, but I couldn't get a good grip on it. I pushed back against them, digging my heels into the carpet as deep as possible. Just then, the phone started to ring. I knew it must be someone calling to help us. I shouted to Talia to answer the phone and tell them what was happening, and to speak loudly as well. I wanted the intruders to know someone was on their way. While she was on the phone with the security company, I was fighting with these two men with all my strength for control over this single door. They pushed it open wide enough for a small adult to slip through, and I shoved back with all my might to get it just about shut again. This struggle went on for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably only a few minutes. The whole time the alarm was blaring loudly. Eventually, the men gave up, and after waiting it out for a while, we felt safe enough to leave the room. My dad got there first, and we told them everything that happened. An armed response team arrived 40 minutes after we spoke to them on the phone. Yeah, geez, we'd already be dead or worse at that point. The police arrived 2 hours after them. Yeah, no one relies on the cops in South Africa. It was only when we were explaining the whole thing to the cops that the reality really started to set in and the adrenaline started to wear off. I went into shock and was all shaky for a bit. I felt grateful that everyone was okay in the end. I'm still amazed by what adrenaline can accomplish. How did my tiny teenage girl self hold back these two huge fully grown men? Completely insane. After that day, I realized just what I'm capable of when this hits the fan. And also that if this goes down, you're really on your own sometimes, and you need to have a plan, because chances are no one is getting there in time to actually help you. So I'm not gonna lie, I sell weed. Because I have a car, sometimes I make deliveries for people who live a little bit further away. A couple of weeks ago, one of my homies needed a sack for himself and a friend of his. I've known this dude for 15 plus years now, so if he says his friend is cool, then I'm cool too. Setting up the sack he wanted and some supplies of my other strains for the buddy, I set out on the 30-minute drive to the south side of my city. Now, I'm not a small woman by any means. I'm 5'6" and weigh 200 pounds of thick muscle. I also carry a 380 on my hip at all times, so I'm not really someone people tend to mess about with. When I arrived at my homie's house, we had our introductions, smoked a blunt, and I started sharing my samples with the new guy. He seemed alright at first. He was polite, made eye contact, didn't fidget too much. My homie said he had to make a phone call and stepped outside. Sounded like he was having some sort of spat with his old lady. The friend and I sparked up the blunt again as we discussed pricing and such for the different buds. Then, out of nowhere, he said this. "Do you know how dangerous it is for a woman to sell cigars?" I stared at him blankly. What the fuck had possessed him to just randomly say that? I shrugged, not really knowing how to respond. Seems like it would be real easy for someone to rob you. And do some other things, too. His voice dripped with something I'd never heard before. Malice, perhaps? This dude was making me feel real nervous, making me cross my legs and drop my hand to my side. I started looking out the window, wondering where my friend was. Oh, he's gonna be a while now. She caught him cheating or something and now they're fighting about it. So, how'd you get into this game? His words seemed genuine once more. The malice I sensed earlier had abated somewhat, so I answered him honestly. Kids, bills, usual story. I began to nervously tap my finger, waiting for my friend to come back in, when he reached out and grabbed a hold of my leg. Not in like the gentle caress you would do if you were making advances either, but a tight squeeze on my knee so tight, it made me gasp in pain and left heavy bruises. You know, I should just take you out back and leave you in the desert. No one would ever know. The dude was fucking threatening me now. Everyone thinks they'll act in a certain way in certain situations. I mean, the whole reason I carry a gun is to protect myself. But I was suddenly frozen in a state of shock. Before either of us could say another thing, my friend threw open the door in a huff. A sigh of relief escaped my lips as the guy released his grip on my knee. I quickly ran to my feet, grabbing my bag and the samples from the table, murmuring about how I had to run. Without even making sure I'd gotten the money for the sack, I booked it to my truck, threw it in reverse, and sped out of there as fast as my truck would allow me. I sprayed rocks behind the tires as I peeled out of that gravel driveway. I haven't been back to see that friend since. I've been dodging his phone calls and visits. I don't need his money that bad. 15 plus years thrown away just because he had bad taste in other people. This happened at the end of summer in 2019. I, female, needed a distraction from my boring university revisions, and as lots of bored single people do, I hopped on Tinder. Nothing too serious really. I was too busy to meet guys anyway. I simply liked talking to people. One day I matched with a guy who I'll name Ted, who was in the same university as I was. He looked very handsome in his pictures. After talking for a few days on the app, and after I had wrongfully decided he was not a criminal, oh the irony, I gave him my number. Again, we talked for a while, then he asked to call me. Nothing too exciting, just the usual getting to know each other. We talked on the phone for a couple of weeks. He called me at random hours of the day and almost every night. I didn't really think that much of it though. During our phone calls, he mostly talked about himself. I didn't really mind though because I didn't like talking much about me. It takes time before I trust anyone. And again, I was bored and a bit lonely. I'd been single for a while, so getting the attention felt quite nice. After a few weeks, Ted asked if I wanted to meet. I said yes because I'd finished with my exams. We met at the city center. When I saw him, I was kind of shocked. He looked nothing like the handsome guy in his pictures. It was definitely still him, you could tell, but good angles and Photoshop truly do make miracles is all I can say. I was a bit taken aback, but I'm not one to judge by looks anyway, so I went on with the date. Thinking back now though, there were some obvious red flags I missed. He kept asking weird questions like, "Are you shy? Why won't you stare into my eyes?" Well, buddy, non-stop eye contact is really weird. I do need to take my eyes off you to pick up my beer from the table or light up a cigarette sometimes. The night went on and we'd had quite a few drinks. Usually, I would never ask someone I just met to come home with me, but I was wearing beer mojito vodka goggles that made my brain blind. We left and spent the night together. In the morning, I drove him to the train station and went back home to have a nap. At the end of the day, he called me and asked if we could meet again the next night. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to see him again though. I knew the only reason I'd brought him home was alcohol in the first place. We didn't really click at all on the date. The idea of rejecting him made me feel guilty though, so I agreed anyway. The day after that, he came to my place again, and there things started to get weird. I started to feel extremely nervous. Something was feeling really off. Thinking back, I think it was probably my guts telling me to get away from this guy. I decided to make things clear. I told him I was not looking for a serious relationship at all, at least not with him. I apologized and decided to bring him home. When we got in the car, he was quite angry. He didn't talk to me and I was embarrassed, so I didn't talk either. We arrived, he got out and slammed the car door quite hard. I knew I'd made quite a few mistakes here. I shouldn't have accepted another date with him knowing I was not into him, and I should have told him sooner I didn't want a relationship. I sincerely did not mean to act so badly. That's why I tried to be honest with him as I could. The next day, I called him and apologized again. He said it was fine and we hung up. I thought that would be it, but oh boy was that not. A few days later, it was time to get back to uni. That morning, I woke up to this gigantic message from him, telling me that the reaction I had a few nights before really threw him off, and he was looking for stability. As soon as I opened the text, he called me. It was 7 in the morning and I'd just woken up, so I couldn't really understand what he was saying. I simply told him again I didn't want to go any further with our relationship. He hung up, and for the next few weeks, things got even weirder. He started following me everywhere on campus, very obviously hiding behind walls to hear my conversations, texting me all hours of the day, even if I was not replying. Calling me 20 times a day even. I thought he was creepy, but that maybe he was hurt and was just coping. Ted was always with a guy we'll call Elliot as well. When I was at the library, they were always sitting together near to where I was. Ted was always watching me as I would study. When I went out for a break, he would follow me. It came to the point where my friends were texting me to warn me he was right behind me. I tried avoiding him, but it was useless. I told him many times I did not want any more contact with him, and he was making me uncomfortable, but nothing worked. He just kept going on, and I was going crazy. 2 weeks later, I was at a party where I met my now boyfriend. I fell in love very quickly. He's the most caring, loving man I've ever met. It's all lovey-dovey, yes, try not to puke on your keyboard. Anyway, in that moment, I knew I needed to put my foot down and stop being so acceptant of Ted's behavior. I explained to him one last time to stop contacting me, and finally blocked him. I truly thought it would be over now. He continued to follow me everywhere on campus though, except he was not with Elliot anymore. One day I was studying in the library. Ted was a few tables away from me, of course, when suddenly someone sat at the table in front of mine. It was Elliot. I looked at Ted and he was glaring at Elliot with the most murderous gaze ever. I thought it was weird. I had never spoken to Elliot before, and he never came near me at all either. I was creeped out. I thought maybe Ted had sent him to talk to me or something. But instead, Elliot just ignored me and I kept on studying. When I went outside for a cigarette, he also blocked Ted from following me. I was a bit surprised, but I didn't think much of it. A few moments later, Ted went outside. Elliot turned his head and watched him till he was out of sight. Then he turned to me and spoke in a hurry. "Hey, I really need to talk to you, okay? I think you're in some danger. I'm sorry, I know it's weird because we don't really know each other, but I'm really worried for you." I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. "We don't have a lot of time before he comes back. When you went out, he came yelling at me because I sat in front of you. When he leaves, we need to talk some more, okay?" I said yes, and I was shaking. At around 6 p.m., Ted finally left after watching me the whole day. We waited another hour to make sure he was gone. We didn't want him to know we were in contact with each other. At 7 p.m., we sat down in the cafeteria, and Elliot told me things that made me shiver. He explained that Ted had had really horrible discourses about women and how he would love to control them. He also explained that a few weeks prior, he'd started to have suspicions about Ted's behavior regarding university classes. He followed random classes every week, sometimes even showed up at Elliot's classes, although he did not follow them, and he didn't seem to have access to the university online platforms either. Elliot did a bit more digging and realized that his friend did not have a university email address, which every member of the university was supposed to have. Elliot went to the administration, and they confirmed what he'd suspected. Ted was not a student. He never was. After that, Elliot completely cut off contact with him. Since then, Ted was harassing him, calling and texting him all the time, following him everywhere. Elliot was shaking as he was telling me this story. I was shaken up as well. But what was coming would reveal itself to be even worse. Elliot explained he absolutely needed to warn me because Ted had started saying some really terrifying things about me specifically. I wanted to cry. Ted was talking about me all the time. Shortly before Elliot cut contact, it got to the point where Ted was making very detailed plans about how he was going to rear me, that he knew where I lived, that he could come whenever he wanted and get me by surprise. He even knew where I parked my car on campus, and he wanted to wait for me in the dark. He always said it with this joking tone, but Elliot got real freaked out. I had tears in my eyes. I knew Ted was a creep, but I could have never imagined it was that bad. At this point, we were near the end of the semester, but we still had a few weeks left. Elliot and I decided to take action because we didn't want to be terrified every time we were on campus. First things first, we contacted university security. Things were taken extremely seriously. One morning when I arrived, the walls were completely covered with posters with a campus emergency number. Elliot and I began constant contact with the chief of security, who was very concerned for our safety. They managed to catch Ted at the library and asked him not to come again. We also went to the police. I don't know the right term for it, but we didn't file a complaint exactly. The police added a note to his record so that if anything happened to us, the police would know what we were worried about in the first place. The officers seemed worried as well. I asked him why. He told me he wasn't allowed to say anything specific, but if I ever saw Ted outside of campus, I needed to call the police without hesitation. How reassuring was that? A few days later, I got a voicemail from Elliot. Told me that he knows things he was not supposed to know. Apparently Ted is mentally sick. He's regularly arrested and locked in mental hospitals. He's an addict, alcoholic, has violent tendencies, was already accused of attempted rape. He lived off invalidity insurance, which explains why he had so much time on his hands to come to university. I would have never guessed that when I met him initially. Later, I contacted one of my acquaintances who works closely with the police. They weren't supposed to, but they confirmed everything. Sent chills down my spine. After that, things calmed down. Ted was still somehow managing to skulk about campus, but he kept a low profile instead. He stopped following us. It was finally the end of the semester. I went away for a few weeks and never set a foot on the campus. I felt a bit relieved. When spring semester started though, Ted was somehow still there, not following any longer but always watching closely. I was so freaked out. Then COVID hit, fortunately. Since then, all courses are online, and I've not seen Ted again. I don't know if he's still creeping on people or if he's now officially a student or what. When I think of him, I'm still shaky. I hope I never run into him again. Just to preface, I'm not going to include any actual details about myself. as I'm in pure fear that somehow this person will track this back to me. I, 24 and male, live in a quiet neighborhood in a suburban town in Queensland, Australia, with my roommate who's a 25-year-old woman. We're childhood friends and are both finishing our studies at university. These occurrences I'm about to tell you about started around 2 months ago, with the most recent update occurring only last weekend. About 2 months ago, I can't recall the exact date, I was lying in bed late at night, watching a soccer game and drifting in and out of sleep. I usually just use this as background noise to help me get to sleep easier, as I would say I'm a very nocturnal person by nature. I was just on the edge of being awake and asleep at once when I heard an urgent pounding at my front door. With the way the house was shaped, my bedroom was approximately 10 meters away from the front door and backed onto the front courtyard. The knock startled me at first. I was unsure if it was just in my head in a dream or actually happening. I laid still in silence to see if I would hear anything further. I knew it couldn't be my roommate, as she was out of town for the week visiting family and attending a wedding. After a bit of waiting, there was a second knock, just as hard. No one called out or said anything though. I'd like to say I'm not easily scared and enjoy watching horror movies in my free time, but suddenly I found myself frozen in place, not able to move at all. No further knocks came after, but I was too frightened now to fall back asleep and didn't end up resting until around 4 a.m. or so. I called my roommate the next morning, asking if she knew anyone that would have come to our door that late in the night. But she was just as confused as I was. A week passed by and I didn't really give it too much thought anymore. I sort of came to the conclusion that maybe it was some drunk person that had mistaken our house for theirs. It was a Saturday night when this happened. I work in a large chain grocery store doing night stacking a few days a week, with my shifts ending between 2 to 4 a.m. usually. It was the next Saturday, and I was approaching the end of my shift when my roommate texted me saying someone was knocking on the front door again. Even though I wasn't actually there, I was struck with that same kind of fear I had experienced just the week prior. She reassured me the doors were all locked, but was scared knowing the same thing had happened to me as well. She kept in touch with me until my shift was over and told me that this time there was no second knock. When I arrived home, the front yard was untouched and there was no one out walking the street either. I must reinstate that this is a very quiet neighborhood, with mostly elderly couples living on our street. In the morning, my roommate still seemed a bit shaken up, so I put in an anonymous tip with a Crime Stopper service. They never got back to me though. Nothing else seemed to happen for the following month and a half. We were both moving on with our lives like it never even happened. I stopped working Saturday night shifts though, as this was the only similarity between the two occurrences. That was until the most recent Saturday. I was up late in the living room, watching some old Black Mirror episodes as the new season was about to come out. It was about 1 a.m. or so, and I had plans to go to bed after that episode I was watching. For context, the room I was in was right next to the front door this time, with the path to the door going past a large window. As I was watching, I saw the outside motion sensor light turn on from the bottom of the windowsill, under the blinds. I froze up. Until this point, I had completely forgotten about that knocking, and I was struck with fear. A short moment later, an urgent knocking began. At first, I was going to sit there and wait for them to go away, but after a second loud knock, I decided to look through the peephole quietly and see if it was someone familiar. My roommate had had a few failed relationships that did not end on good terms, so I assumed maybe it was one of them trying to mess with her. But as I looked closer, it was not. It was a woman I had never seen before. She was just staring at the door, stood still like a statue. It was like she was frozen solid. Her eyes were staring straight ahead with no expression. It was like she could see me through the eye hole, just staring into my soul. She stood there for another 2 minutes or so until she looked to the side and ran off into the darkness. I called the cops and explained on the phone what had happened, and they sent someone shortly thereafter. They checked all the cars parked on the street, but came up empty-handed. They just told me to call back if anything happened again. The thing that I couldn't get out of my head, though, was the way she just stood there emotionless, staring straight ahead as if she wasn't thinking at all, and the strange way she ran off as well. She looked to be in her 30s or so, wearing a small nightdress and no shoes. Not exactly someone I'd ever seen in a neighborhood before. Not only was this out of the ordinary, but it was completely freezing outside as well. Since then, I've ordered one of those doorbell cameras, just in case she does come back. To be completely honest with you though, I flinch whenever someone knocks on that door now. If I said Medellin, Colombia, what do you think of? Pre-2015, only a handful of people would have given the answer that's commonplace today. But since that Narcos show was on TV, almost everyone knows what Medellin is famous for now, and that's for being the home of the Medellin cartel, headed up by the one and only Pablo Escobar. These days, that cartel is confined to the history books, but the legacy of their violence lives on in the city, and the countless problems didn't exactly die along with Escobar when the law caught up with him back in '93. It's there in that city that I met a girl named Stephanie while I was traveling around South America. Steph was from Canada, on a similar sort of rolling vacation as I was. There was almost this instant chemistry between us that ended with me asking her out. We drank cheap Colombian beers, compared traveling tattoos. She definitely won with her traditional tippy-tap Filipino tribal piece, and generally just had ourselves a great time. When it came to the end of the night, though, we were put in a rather precarious position. You see, the old legacy of violence and suspicion means that in a city like Medellin, you can't get anywhere without the right credentials. As a result, neither of us were allowed any guests in our respective hostels. We thought on our feet and decided the night was warm enough for us to spend it in one of Medellin's public parks. So we spot what seemed like a nice enough place to lay down. Only, as we're walking over, we see these 4 Colombian guys hanging out on a bench. No reason to be suspicious right away, right? I mean, it was a nice enough night, and the South American idea of a late night is totally different to our own. Not everyone hanging out past midnight is some kind of reprobate or something. I suppose that goes for the States too, but I digress. So me and Steph are sitting there for a few minutes when one of the guys from the bench comes over to talk to us. My Spanish was still embarrassingly dire at that time, but I knew enough to know he was asking for a cigarette. I told him I didn't smoke, but he carried on asking for stuff like money, then other things with words I didn't quite understand. I kept telling him I didn't know what he was saying, but he just wouldn't give up. He kept on talking us, then spit out something mean-sounding in Steph's direction. At that point, I took issue. I have enough Dutch courage to tell him to get off before I led Steph off to another spot farther away from them. I'll spare you the finer details of what followed, but needless to say, Steph and I ended up having a little cuddle, shall we say, until we heard and saw something that almost scared us half to death. A police siren and flashing lights, just a few feet away, near the boundary of the park. Steph quickly pulled her dress back on, and we attempted to make ourselves as presentable as possible as the cop car screeched to a stop. 2 guys jumped out, and they came jogging over to us. How they knew we were there, I don't know, but I figured the guy asking for smokes had called them as a kind of screw you for not being generous sort of thing. I was on the verge of a full-on freakout. All I could think of now was how I was going to end up in a Colombian jail, and that would be the end of it for me. Colombia has some of the worst prisons in all of South America, and no offense to our Latin cousins, but that's really saying something. What's worse, I didn't have the money to pay a fine or a bribe, so there was zero chance of me talking my way out of it. Still, I didn't really have much of a choice. The best I could hope for was to pull off a speech skill 100 check, so I got down to it. As this little Colombian cop, I don't even say that to be mean, the guy was literally no bigger than 5'4" or so, was shining his flashlight in my face. I was pouring out a string of bilingual apologetic consciousness. All the cop did was scold us in Spanish, talking so fast I couldn't even understand a word. Steph was welling up with tears at this point, as she too thought she was going to be arrested. All I could do was shut up and let the cop burn off whatever angry energy he had. I prayed he wouldn't just drag us off to jail then and there. I told him I couldn't understand, until he finally calmed down and pulled a smartphone out of his police vest. That's when I saw him pulling up Google Translate, and I knew something wasn't quite right here. If he was here to throw the cuffs on us, surely he'd have already done it, right? So what was he about to type out? I'll never forget what came next, and how I foolishly tried to anticipate his words without stopping to consider the context. The first thing he typed was "these men" and pointed over to where the cigarette guy and his friends had been. I looked over, expecting to see them all looking smug, but no one was there any longer. It dawned on me that they'd beat feet as soon as they'd seen the cops arrive. I was about to say something like, "Yeah, I know they called you, I'm sorry," but the cop cut me off with a little sock puppet hand gesture. I watched him type further. "These men are very dangerous. You need to leave now. They will come back." The cop stopped for a second, like he was trying to find the right word. "They'll come back and they'll violate the girl, you understand?" My chin was dusting the floor at this point. I had no idea we were in that much danger. Right before I could say anything else, the man typed once more. "These people are known to us. They've done things before and they'll do them again." Again, we just nodded, too stunned by how dumb I'd been to really be relieved that we weren't in any trouble. "Don't come back here again during the night, no matter what." He showed us the message and escorted us to a well-lit street nearby. As you can imagine, that whole thing really killed the mood, and even though I walked Steph back to her hostel, there was never any talk of me getting inside to continue where we left off. I saw her a few more times before she moved on to Argentina. And yes, we did conclude some unfinished business, even kept in touch for a while after I returned to the US. But you can bet your bottom dollar I did not go anywhere near any poorly lit places in Medellin for the remainder of my stay. I learned my lesson, and I learned it real good. I can't say I necessarily enjoyed going out and exploring the countryside, but it is something that I did a whole lot when I was younger. I think mostly because living out in the country, there wasn't exactly a whole lot else to do. My family never had cable back then, because this happened so long ago and it wasn't available in such a rural area. Other than that, we also lived far enough away from any of my friends or relatives that we couldn't spend time with them often and do things together. So, a lot of my free time, especially in the summer, was spent exploring the countryside on my lonesome. I didn't know a lot about the history of the area that we lived in, and this was before it was easy to just look these things up on the internet. Because of this, I never knew if I would find anything interesting or noteworthy out there. I always thought it would be cool to come across an Indian arrowhead or something like that. Like pretty much every kid in the world who goes out exploring in the country, I always hoped I would find something valuable out there one day. I mean, who knew if there was a gold piece stuck out there somewhere or something? Anyway, this one day in this one summer, I was really bored and went off exploring as usual. This time though, I tried heading off in a direction I hadn't really ever gone in before. I had avoided it mostly because my dad told me to. It was private property, I guess, and the man who owned it got very angry if he caught anyone out there. Plus, he claimed there were abandoned mines out there, and if I accidentally fell into one of those, it might be the last time anyone ever saw me alive. I went off in that direction, only slightly worried that one of these fates might befall me. I guess the slight fear made the hike a little bit more interesting. Other than that though, it was kind of fun thinking about the possibility of getting caught too. I don't know how long I had been out there, nor how many hills I had crossed over already. Eventually though, being on one side of a particular hill, I looked over at the one opposite facing it. I saw that inlaid about 3/4 of the way up the hill was what looked like either a cave or some sort of mine driven into the side. I assumed because of where it was most likely just a cave. It didn't look like it would be that easy to climb to, but it seemed very interesting to me, so I decided to go check it out. Getting to the opening was not easy. The hill was a whole lot steeper than the other ones I had experience with. After quite a bit of effort, including grasping onto trees that had thorns and caused my hands to bleed a little, I was finally able to make it up that steep hill and to the opening of this cave. I was actually a little bit apprehensive right away. This was the first such cave I had ever come across, despite all of the time I'd spent out there exploring. It was, as you might imagine, very, very dark, and I had only brought a small flashlight with me. I hadn't expected to come across a cave or be out after dark, so it was only one of those pen flashlights I always had with me in my backpack. It was a little damp inside, but that didn't really bother me so much. It was easy enough to avoid stepping into the water. Mostly, I was worried about the possibility of disturbing any bats that were in there. We didn't have as good an understanding about them back then as we do nowadays, so we thought that all bats bit, and they all carried rabies as well. It was bright enough at the opening. As I made my way into the cave though, I took out my pen light just in case I would need it. Of course, the very first thing I did was look at the ceiling to see if there were any bats inside. Fortunately, at least in the concern of my feelings, I was happy not to see any in there. I probably would have screamed and started running had I seen even one of them. As I kept walking further into the cave, the light I got from the outside was now nearly gone. Soon, it was gone altogether. I suppose I should have headed back when it got to that point, but I was way too captured by curiosity with all of this. Although the entrance seemed to be a normal natural cave, further in it had wooden beams inside that looked like they had been made to reinforce the structure. Perhaps people had mined in this cave before. I mean, I didn't know enough about the differences between caves and mines to really know. The weirdest part though at this point were the echoes. My footfalls would sound like the footfalls of other people. A couple of times I even jumped, thinking that I heard someone following behind me. I was able to calm myself down after each try though, when suddenly I noticed something up ahead. It looked like something was lying on the ground up against the wall of the cave. It was too hard to make out in the dark at first, being that I only had this small light on me. However, as I got closer, I noticed something that stuck with me to this very day. There were bones in that cave. Although it was not a complete skeleton, I was able to tell there was a human skull there. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that before, and it truly scared me. I knew though that these bones had been there for a very long time, and whatever had killed this person couldn't possibly still be there to be a danger to me. But then I heard it. It sounded like someone whispering further down the cave. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly at first, but when I froze and did my best to listen, I began to make it out clearer. There was absolutely someone whispering deeper in the darkness of that cave, echoing all the way up to me. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it was definitely a human voice. That was even scarier to me than finding that skull there. I got up and tried my best to hurry up out of the cave. I heard the whispering following behind me as I made my way back to the entrance. While I wasn't scared before going into the cave with the meager light, I was scared to death coming back out of it. I didn't want to run and make too much noise. If that person deeper in the cave was following me, I didn't want them to know exactly where I was. After I made it out, I ran down that hill fast as I could. I was very lucky not to fall down that steep slope and hurt myself. I don't know who could have been making those whispering sounds, but I never went back to find out. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.